I don't have the power to do this.
That's probably true. Lack of power is my dilemma. So I'm asked to talk about two steps that I think are the forgotten steps. Step 6 and step 7. And my experience, and I tell you, I think that the things that are the most value that we share with each other is our mistakes. It's not our successes, because I connect with your mistakes and find little bits and pieces of me in your experience. And I had a tough time with step 6 and 7. I didn't understand them. I sloughed over them. There's only a little paragraph in the book for each one, and which sort of to me said, not a big deal, little paragraph, nothing. And yet, I'm here to tell you that I think the story of the last 43 and a half years of my life has been the story of step 6. How I've become repeatedly entirely ready. You know, there's an old adage in Alcoholics Anonymous, when they talk about step 3, it says that the story is there's 3 frogs sitting on a log. One of them makes a decision to jump in the water. How many are left? And it's, well, still 3, because he only made a decision. If he really surrendered, you'd hear the splash in step 6. That's where you'd hear the splash. Chuck used to say that this was a process of uncovering, discovering, and discarding. Well, I do inventories, a couple inventories of my early sobriety. I finally did the first one out of the book. I liked Kent's presentation on the 4th step. It was very similar to my experience. I had a transformational experience in step 4. When I started to look at everyone I had judged so harshly in all my opinions, and when I looked at it from the other side of the street, through their eyes, and it was a game changer for me. And so I come out the 5th step, and my God, I felt like I was wrong about everything. And I was. I never would have imagined I was so opinionated and so, I just would have imagined. I'm too nice a guy for that, you know? But I was like horribly opinionated and judgmental, and I came out the backside in some of those, with a lot of self-reduction. A lot of ego reduction at depth, as Dr. Harry Tiebout talks about the necessity of that. And I had that because I was wrong, and I was wrong, and I was wrong about them, and I was wrong. And I come out the backside, and my sponsor told me I should do step 6 and 7, and I went to the book and just quickly, I didn't know you can do step 6 and 7 if you just read it pretty quick. And I missed, there was a prayer there, and I missed it. I saw the 7-step prayer, said that, but I missed the 6-step prayer. And it's odd. I don't know, truly, I don't know if I missed it because unconsciously my ego wanted me to miss it, or if I really just didn't get it. But I never said that prayer. I went right into the amends part of the process, and I started to get really weird. What was happening to me is that I understood in an intellectual manner the defects of character, these aspects of my own selfishness and self-centeredness that had been defeating me. I understood that, but I kind of thought it was my job to kind of keep this stuff in check, you know. I don't want to look like a bad AA member. You got to keep this stuff in check, and I tried to keep it in check. And what happened to me is what Wilson talks about on page 101. He talks about a dynamic, and I'm often amazed how the realm of the spirit is influenced in a similar manner to the laws of physics. And in one of the laws of physics is for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And so Wilson says, he's talking about on page 101, he's talking about a view of alcoholism. Now, my experience, alcoholism is what I am left with when you take away the alcohol. And he says, in our belief, any scheme of combating alcoholism which proposes to shield the sick man from temptation is doomed to failure. If the alcoholic tries to shield himself, he may succeed for a time, but he usually winds up with a bigger explosion than ever. We have tried these methods, these attempts to do the impossible have always failed, and they failed me. And this dynamic that they're talking about of willfully suppressing or defending myself against these things that I understand are intellectually objectionable, seem to give them torque. It's as if the more I willfully pressed on the defect, the more energy it developed. And I would have, just like it says here, a bigger explosion than ever. Give you a good example. One of the defects that I had that was pretty bad and very objectionable was anger. Anger to the point on occasion to violence or rage. And I get it. I'm not stupid. I get this is bad. This can get you in a lot of trouble. And so I suppressed it. And I would have these explosions. And the last one, I was 8 years sober, and by this time I'd become somewhat successful in the material world, and success feeds the ego and the entitlement, and all that, and that's what had happened to me, and I had an incident in my business. I owned a small chain of retail stores by this time, and someone had been stealing a lot from me. Like, we're talking a lot, 50, 60 grand. We don't even know. We have no idea. So I set a trap for them, and they were stealing these. We sold these very expensive bottles of wine, up to like $3,000, $4,000, some of those bottles, and they were stealing them out of one of my stores. So I had one of my employees hollow out some big wine cases and make a stack out of them. And he stood inside with two little holes where he could, for his eyes, and he could look at. And he stood there the whole shift. And he caught the guy. And it's 11:30 at night. And he calls me up and he says, "We got the guy who's been stealing from us." I said, "Oh, I'll be right there." And I was there so quick. I was there well before the police ever showed up. And they got two of my employees, have this guy spread-eagled over the hood of his car. And in the back seat, he's got about 6 or 8 of these like $100 to $500 bottles of wine. And when I saw who it was, he was a guy, I kind of considered him a friend, sort of. I'd done him a lot of favors for him. He was one of my customers I really liked. And I saw who it was, and I thought, oh, no, not you. And he looked at me, and he said, "Well, I heard you're in AA. I thought maybe you'd understand." And I snapped, and I grabbed him by the hair, and I was banging his head against the hood of his car. Oh, I'm not proud of this. And two of my employees, they stopped me. They pulled me off it. They said, you're going to leave marks. You can go to jail for this. And I'll tell you something. I couldn't stand myself after that. I couldn't stand myself. Here's a guy who knows I'm in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have just been the worst example of Alcoholics Anonymous he could ever see. And I think sometimes becoming entirely ready is you get to that place where you just can't stand you anymore. And maybe that's where you hear the splash. And I've not had an incident. That was 35 years ago. I've not had an incident like that since then. I don't know why that is, except that maybe I got surrendered enough to let a little bit of God's grace in, I guess. And it's a piece of business in my life. I don't ever want to be that guy again. So I try to nip it in the bud when I look in step 10, I got to catch it. I love what Wilson says in the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, that when we're disturbed at all, that's the flag. Bob, there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. And I gotta take it to God right away. I can't wait. I remember I was really very close friends with a guy named Sandy, and Sandy, I went down to Tampa and saw him a few days after his daughter had been beaten to death. And I remember walking in there, because I was concerned about him. He'd had a tough 6 months, hip replacement, knee replacement. His girlfriend left him. His daughter was beaten to death. And I went down to see him because he was a dear friend. And the minute I walked in, he says, I already forgave him. I didn't even ask him anything. He just says, I forgave him right away. He said, I had to because I couldn't let it get into me, because it would have eaten me alive. And I think maybe that's what happens with some of this stuff. I have to defend Bob against Bob, right? Because I'm the only enemy here. And so how do you become entirely ready? Well, this baffled me for a long time. I would... Somebody else hear that? Because I hope I'm not the only one. I remember we had a meeting in Vegas. It was the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions meeting on a Sunday night. It was called the Rule 62 group. Doesn't exist anymore. It used to go float from people's homes. And I went to that meeting one time, and I wasn't doing very well because I was being plagued by lust, by ego. You catch yourself trying to be a big shot, trying to show, you know what I mean? Looking for attention. And I was hitting these bottoms with all this stuff. And so I go to that meeting, and they're on step 6. And if you've ever read step 6 in the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, it's very identifiable with, everything from smug superiority to, it's just an amazing chapter. And I'm in the meeting, and people are sharing, and they're sharing about their defects of character in the past tense. Like these are things that they've gotten over. And I'm sitting there in the middle of some of them, right? And I'm sober a little bit longer than a couple of the people in here who have gotten over them. And they were talking about anger and lust and pride and all this stuff in the past tense. And I remember sitting there just feeling horribly less than, just thinking to myself, am I the only guy in AA God doesn't like? How come these guys have gotten all this stuff removed? And I discovered later that they lied about other things also. Right? And I understand the game of the ego-feeding proposition of wanting to look like you've arrived somewhere. And some of those people struggled. Some of those people aren't even sober today. And some of them struggled with a lot of the things that I was struggling with that day. Their pride was so strong they couldn't admit it. And I get that. Boy, do I get that. I've been obsessed at times with what people think of me. And what a handicap. Because you'll never be yourself. You'll never even find out who you are, because you'll be too busy trying to be what you think other people want you to be. And you'll never discover who you are. So I get that, and I started hitting bottoms with, and not just once. I would hit a bottom with something where I'd get to a place, I think, I'm never going to do that again. And I didn't for a month or two. When Wilson says that lack of power is our dilemma, what I was doing is I was trying to manage this. I didn't even know that. I didn't. It wasn't like I sat down and said, okay, these are my defects of character. I'm going to take care of this. I never thought that to myself. Yet, if you would have watched my approach, that was the approach of someone who thought that, right? And I'm often amazed how much of me is below the surface in the subconscious, right? And how much disconnected I am from that. And yet it drives me, it affects me. And so I started hitting all these bottoms, and I was probably not too long after that anger, that last violent episode, I was hitting bottoms with some other things also. And I went to a meeting, and they were reading the 12 steps. And God's funny how he'll shift my perception just a little bit for me to really get what I'm supposed to get. And someone was reading the steps, and they got to step 7, and it seemed like they screamed the word humbly. They didn't. But I got it, and I understood why it says humbly, because I have been failing here. I've been failing. And I tried to do this on my own power. And there's an old adage that I use with the guys I sponsor. I made sort of an adage with me anyway, that without him, I can't. But without me, he won't. And so my part is to empty myself out of me enough to receive God's grace and to become entirely ready. And to realize the truth. The humility is in the truth. And the truth is there's a lot of these things I can't manage. I mean, I can dress it up and look like but I can't really. I remember the first time I really come up against this, and I didn't put it together for many, many, many years later. I'm at a meeting, and I finally woke up to the fact what they're talking about in the book. Selfishness, self-centeredness is the root of our troubles. I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm self-centered. It was like, I never knew. Now everybody knew. My mother used to tell me when I was a little kid, Rob, you're full of yourself. One time she said to me, you think you're the center of the universe. I looked at her and I went, everything revolved around me. And I didn't get it. And I'm sober a little while, and I finally wake up. And here's the naivete, how naive I am. I think knowledge is power. So I thought, okay, now that I know I'm self-centered, just won't be that way anymore. Now, some of you have been to that spot where you told yourself, okay, I'm not going to be that way anymore, and you are, right? Because the lack of power truly is my dilemma, and I need God's help, and I need God's help desperately, or else I'll never change. You know, when Chamberlain used to say uncover, discover, discard, it refers to several parts of the book. One is where we find the great reality deep down within us. And it says, but Bob, you're blocked. It's obscured from you. And then later on in that segue between step 3 and step 4, it talks about the vital decision of step 3, but it'll have little permanent effect unless you get rid of the things that are blocking you. See, and what's blocking me? What's blocking me? Me. I got too much of me between me and God's grace. I got too much of me between me and you. And you know, when I say that, you think, somebody might be sitting here thinking, what do you mean you got too much of you? That opinion and judgment about what I just said is you between you and me, right? Right there. And that's what I do. I'm full of opinions. I've spent the last 10 or 15 years, I've been fanatically trying to adopt the principles of the long form of the 12 traditions in my life. And I'll tell you what I discovered. I think the 10th tradition is my only hope of facilitating the decision made in step 3. In the long form of the 10th tradition, it says that no group or member, which is kind of like me, no group or member ought to express any opinion on outside controversial issues. Well, then what do we talk about? I mean, what do you talk about then? Because I'm an opinion generating ego, right? That's what I do. I have some pretty strong and accurate opinions about stuff I don't even know anything about. And it happens all the time. So I read a lot because I think there's power in knowledge. And isn't that what I want more than anything is power? Power. The book says, first of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Power seekers are people who play God. I'm a God player. And so, first of all, we had to quit playing God. Why? Well, because the book says the truth, because it doesn't work. And so, I suffer myself. And I suffer separation and sobriety. I heard Mildred one time tell a story. She was sober a long time and she realized she didn't have any friends. I've had that feeling in Alcoholics Anonymous, sober a number of years, and feel a sense of separation. And everyone that I watched that seemed to have some degree of intimacy, what they had seemed to be a little bit beyond me. And I don't know why. I know why today, because I got too much of me between me and you. And I don't, so in this process of self-reduction, ego reduction, in this process of trying to become free of this bondage of self, is a series of bottoms. My sponsor, Clancy, who I miss him. He died a little over a year and a half ago. He told a story one time. He said, and Chamberlain at one time had talked about being surrendered by the bottle, and that had happened to me. That's when I was able to get a sponsor. That was when I was able to follow directions I never would. I'd been surrendered by the bottle, but then Thibault talks about the amazing recuperative powers of the alcoholic ego. And we're all like that. I can be one day, I don't know anything. Help me. I'll do anything you want. Then 2 weeks later, you want me to do what? Isn't that bizarre? How the ego comes back, and it comes back smart because it's been reading the book. It's been not only reading the book, it's probably reading other spiritual books. It's reading whatever. It wants power. And so, I'm full of me. As my mother told me when I was a kid, you're full of yourself. I was full of myself. And when you're full of yourself, there's not much room for anything else. There's not much room for intimacy. There's not much room for friendships. There's not much room for God. All the things that are of value in my life, I fill up with me, and it pushes them out. And I don't mean to do that. And I don't even know I'm doing it, for God's sakes, except when I understand and feel the symptoms of it. The ego and God have a lot of things in common. I've never seen God eyeball to eyeball. I've seen his presence. I've seen evidence of his presence continually in my life, continually. I've never seen my ego eyeball to eyeball, but my God, I've suffered its presence in my life. And so both of them are there. And they're there, one of my sponsees talks about circumstantial evidence. The overwhelming circumstantial evidence that my ego's there and that God's there. And somewhere I seem always to be somewhere on the spectrum between God-reliant and self-reliant, between a life driven by fear and a life full of love, between you and me. And I'm always somewhere on that spectrum. On a good spiritual hair day, it's love, it's God reliance, it's concern with you. On a bad spiritual hair day, I'm easily offended. And I know how you're not doing it right. It's a gift. It's a gift. I just know. I'll just sit there and judge. Just sit there and go, you don't know what you're talking about. And that's not a good day for me. I've had those days, not good days. So I started asking myself the right questions. Like, what is it? Why do I hang on to what is these things? I understand it's kind of when I'm hanging on to lust, I'm hanging on to anger, I'm hanging on to pride. But why? Because they're defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms that at one time had served me. You know, anger, when I was a kid, just starting to go out into the world and hanging out with some criminals and stuff, I discovered some of these people were scary, but if I acted like an angry, insane person, they would just respect that. They'd give me a wide berth. Well, when you're a kid hanging out with delinquent people and that you have to defend yourself against them, it's an effective defense mechanism. It's not very good when you're an AA member and you're doing that. Right? All it does is it doesn't protect me, it makes my life worse. And so why do I hang on to this stuff? And it's because somewhere I have an illusion of value in these broken defense mechanisms. And they are broken. I can give you 100 examples. You know, lust is a defense mechanism against loneliness. Because if you don't know how to do intimacy, you settle for lust because it's as close as you can get, right? It's a defense mechanism against loneliness, against a world that you're afraid is going to be ungratifying, a world that's going to be boring, a life that's going to be boring. And so what you do is you settle for lust. And the problem with that is if you've ever had inappropriate sexual relations to fill your vacancies with loneliness and all that other stuff, gratification, afterwards you feel worse, right? You feel worse. I think inappropriate, use lust as a defense mechanism is almost like the antithesis and the opposite of going to Disneyland on the 4th of July when the humidity is 98%, it's 100 degrees, and you'll stand in line to go on the new Avatar ride for 6 hours with 5,000 kids that have overdosed on sugar, and you'll feel like you're in hell for six hours in line, just like I want to die. And you do all of that for 30 seconds of excitement. With lust, we'll give you the 30 seconds up front, and then you're going to feel bad about yourself for about 6 months, right? It will dim and diminish my spirit. And that's what defects of character do. They dim and diminish my spirit. You know, Alcoholics Anonymous would never imply that I should let go of or ask God to remove something that's effective, that works. We're talking about the stuff that's defective, that doesn't work. That even though at one time it looked like an asset, it has become a horrible, horrible liability. And I think some of us have to slam our head up against that reality to realize that in order to become entirely ready. And then the problem I experienced after, you start to get some of that is, okay, how do I become, I don't know what entirely ready looks like. See, I fancied that I was I looked at all these defects, and I fancied I was entirely ready to have God remove them. You know what I really was? I was entirely ready to have God remove the consequences of them. Because that, and Wilson in his story, he talks about step 6 and 7 differently than anywhere else I've seen in AA literature. He's going through the steps with Ebby in Towns Hospital, the Oxford version of the shorter version of the steps, and he gets to step 6 and 7, and he says, I ask my Creator to remove my sin's root and branch. And the implication is that there's two parts. There's two parts. There's the branch, it's been poking me in the eye, but what's the root? The illusion of how it serves self, how it protects me. And once I can see through the illusion and see the truth, then turning to God with this is pretty serious. It's very much like drinking. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 20 years old and didn't get sober until 1978. And it wasn't from not wanting to be so. I wanted to stop having the branches poke me. I wanted to get free of the consequences of my drinking. But I still had an illusion, a hopeful illusion of attaining the value I'd once found in drinking. You know that feeling? That effect produced by alcohol that guys like me become obsessed with. The feeling of freedom, the feeling of significance, the feeling of connection. And I still fantasized and hoped that effect was available to me years past the point where it stopped working. But I chased it. And I chased the effect produced by alcohol. And I think that my defects are very much the same. I have an illusion that there's value there. And so until I can have the same awakening with the defect that I had with drinking, why would I go to God? Why would I come to you? I mean, I don't know anybody that comes to AA and quits drinking when drinking's still fun. I mean, and if you do that, you'll never have a bad day again the rest of your life. This was going in and out. I don't know. I think the battery's dying, or could be me. I don't know. So I started asking myself, well, okay, what if I can't reproduce everything that drove me into Alcoholics Anonymous, that hopelessness, that bottom? What if I can't reproduce that? And the beauty of Alcoholics Anonymous is this is not a faith-based program, it's an action-based program. And so I started looking at, well, if I really, okay, let's assume, evidently, because maybe I'm not entirely, because entirely is a lot. Maybe I'm not entirely ready, but how would a person who is entirely ready act? Good question. And can I take those actions? Can I change my attitude, which is, if you're a pilot, your attitude is your angle of approach. Could I change my angle of approach to life when it comes to these defects? Could I start taking actions that are contrary to the defect? actions that feeds their antithesis rather than feed the defect. Could I do that? And I started doing that for some things, and I get the results were slow. I would get discouraged, but the great thing is I've had a couple early experiences with stuff that I could not get to budge. One of them, I was scared that I was going to die of lung cancer because I was smoking about 3 packs a day. I mean, I would light cigarettes from cigarettes. I was that kind of smoker, and I couldn't stop. I tried to stop 3 times in my first 4 or 5 years of sobriety, and I failed bitterly each time and ended up smoking more than ever. And I got so discouraged after the last failure. I just thought, I can't do this. I don't know what's going to happen. What do I have to lose a lung in order to become entirely ready to have God remove this? Is that what's going to happen to me? And I was a DCM at the time, and I went to a process. We have these big area service assemblies that contain a whole bunch of states and areas, and I was involved in a panel in one of those processes, and I was sitting in the restaurant, the coffee shop, between sessions with a guy that I sponsor, and I overheard a conversation from 2 guys from San Francisco in the next booth. And they got my attention because the one guy said to the other guy, he said, "So, when did you quit smoking?" And he says, "Oh, I didn't quit." And he said, "Did you ever smoke?" He said, "Oh yeah, I used to smoke 2 packs a day." He says, "Well, I've known you for a half dozen years. I've never seen you smoke. So when did you quit?" And he says, "I didn't quit." Now he's got my attention. And he said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, "Well, I had to surrender to the fact that I can't quit." And I just started asking God every single day for the desire not to smoke without the willful intention of quitting. Take you right out of the equation. And I remember sitting there listening to that, and I thought, oh my God, I can't quit, but I could do that. And I started doing it. And I'll tell you, it was probably 6 months every day, sometimes a couple times a day, every time I'd get a desire to smoke. And I would smoke anyway. I remember lighting up a cigarette, taking a hit and going, "God, give me the desire not to smoke. But I'm not quitting." Right? And I did that. And then one day I got up and something had happened. I didn't do it. It just happened. It had been lifted off of me. It took 6 months. Sometimes God's slow, but he's very old. You can't give God the bum's rush. There's a great line in step 11 in the 12 steps and 12 traditions that says that we do get guidance and direction in our life just to the extent that we stop demanding it in our time and on our terms. One of the greatest thing in Alcoholics Anonymous for me is the word only in step 11. It codifies exactly what we're about. We have the word only in there because we don't pray for anything specific. We don't give God orders. We don't tell him what to do because we know from our painful experience, we know we don't know. And so we pray only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. I've been very, very lucky. My first sponsor, and I'll probably talk about this later when we get to step 12, pushed me into 12-step work, pushed me into saying yes and sponsoring people into hospitals and institutions. I mean, he was a fanatic about that stuff. And I started doing it. And if you start sponsoring a lot of people, it changes the sponsor more than you'll ever change the sponsee. It changes you. And one of the great changes that have started to occur in me is I had all these guys that were newer, and I started to wake up to something. that they look towards me as an example of how to live your life sober. I'll tell you, that's a lot of pressure. And I'll tell you what else started happening to me. There was things I was doing that if it was just about me, I would have continued to do them. But I realized I was having a negative effect on the people I sponsor, and I love those guys, except for Kim. I love those guys. And I didn't want to be a bad example. And sponsees are often like children. You know, I mean, if you get a bunch of new guys, it's like you go to your home group, sit up straight, don't leave her alone, stop that, you know, right? Just put that phone down, you know, I mean, it is, it's like having a bunch of crazy ADD kids. and they'll watch you, and they won't emulate the good stuff you do. They'll wait and catch you do something, and they'll do that. It's like if you're at a little kid, you can be impeccable with your language, say wonderful, beautiful things about love and God and all that stuff. Kids don't pick that up. Use the F word once. And they'll go around, they'll say it to anyone who they see, right? They don't even know what it means, but they get that there's power in it. And the defects that pick up from others are the ones that look like that person has power I don't have. I'm surprised how much, how ruled I have been by a lack of power, and how most of the things that have caused me problems in sobriety had with them an illusion of power. That's what anger is. Anger as an illusion of power. Resentments. You know that feel like you got a resentment, someone's hurt you or they're not doing it right or something, you know, and you start having a conversation with them in your head. Yeah, I'll say this to them. And they'll defend themselves. They'll say that. Of course they will. Of course they will. And then I'll say this. And that'll make them a little upset. And then they'll say that. And then I'll say this. And then they'll say that. And then I will say this. And it will bring them to their knees. And when you're doing that in your head, the feeling of power, you know, oh. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. When I was a little kid, there was a TV show. I don't know if it was in Canada or not, but it was in the U.S. And it was so popular at one time that at Universal Studios, they had some of the set from the TV show was part of the tour on the tram, and then it burnt down, but it was a firehouse. And it was called Rescue 8. And it was about these two paramedics that would go out on distress calls when people are in trouble. And this one episode, and it's odd, I've often wondered, how come I probably watched 50 to 100 episodes of Rescue 8. How come I remembered this one? Who knows? I remember this one, and it was this episode that the two paramedics show up at this site, and there's these parents are there, and they're very upset because their little girl, this cute little girl, is crying hysterically because she has her arm wedged into a vending machine, and their parents have been trying to get it out, and it just hurts her. They can't get it out. And of course, the paramedics very gently they can't get it out either. Now the firemen are showing up, and they're bringing the torches and the electric saws off the trucks, and they're talking about this plan of cutting the door out from around the girl's arm, which is freaking the parents out and freaking her out and scaring her more. And the one paramedic's watching all this, and he walks over to her and he kneels down next to her and he says, "Sweetheart, do you have something in your hand?" "Uh-huh. What do you got in your hand?" She goes, "A candy bar. Would you let go of..." "No, it's my candy bar. It's my anger. It's my porno. It's my gambling. It's my lust. She won't let go of the candy bar. And he doesn't know what to do, so he backs away and he stands there pensive for a minute and he walks back over. And as he's walking close to her, she's looking at him like, get away from me. You're the guy trying to take away my candy bar. And he kneels down next to her and he says, sweetheart, I'm just here to make you a promise. And she says, what? I want to promise you 2 brand new candy bars if you'll let go of the crumpled one in your hand. And she says, really? And he says, I promise. And because she trusts him, she lets go of the candy bar and her arm slides out of the vending machine. So the question is, what's your candy bar? We don't hold on to objectionable things that are intellectually objectionable that have caused us trouble for no reason. I mean, alcoholics often to psychiatrists and psychologists, we look like we're self-destructive people. We're not self-destructive, we're self-serving. We're self-obsessed. I'm obsessively self-concerned, but I'm not self-destructive, even though at times my behavior has looked like it. And so what's your candy bar? And do you understand that it's broken and crumbled and it's of no value? And even more importantly, do you trust God enough to let go of the thing you've been using to defend yourself, to protect yourself? Do you? And I tell you, I'm sad to say there have been times in my sobriety with certain things, I think to myself, do I? Almost. Not quite yet. And then there are other times it's like, absolutely. God, take this from me. Take this from me. And what am I offering to give up? Well, I forget that I made a decision in step 3 that this primarily has a couple aspects. The first aspect is I'm trying to make my life none of my business. When I say to God, I offer myself to you for you to build with me and do with me as you will, not as I will. I'm giving up my right to have an opinion about my own life. I'm trying from this moment on to make my life none of my business and trust that God knows more about what's good for me than I do. And if you have a track record anything like mine, you get that. I mean, phew. My life run on self-will was a disaster. So I say that to God, and I realize the truth. The truth is I can't. I can't. How do I make my life none of my business when it is the only thing I'm concerned with is me and my emotions and my relief and my sex and my money and my security and what you think of me? If that's the number one piece of business inside of you, how do you give that up? You can't. If you're like me, you know you should, but I can't. So I'm asking God to do something that if he's got to do it to some degree or I don't have any chance here, to relieve me of this bondage of self. And he will do that by entering into the rest of the process that is designed for self-reduction. Relieve me of this bondage of self so that I can better do your will. Because without some self-reduction, I don't have a chance here to overcome my obsessive self-concern. I can't. And then the last part I didn't understand for a while, and it says, take away my difficulties. What difficulties? Difficulties with the bondage of self. Difficulties we're gonna try to look for by looking for the symptoms of the bondage of self. When I look for resentment, selfishness, dishonesty, fear, I'm gonna spend the rest of my life looking for the symptoms of the return of the ego dominance in my life. And then do that. God, please do that. Take away these difficulties for one reason. Just one. Not so I'll be happy. Not so I'll be successful. Take them away so that victory over them would bear witness to those I would help. Of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. And so we sponsor people in Alcoholics Anonymous. It is our primary purpose here. We help people. We do service. We try to be, we try to think about the new people and the people in AA that are suffering, which is such a blessing because, as my sponsor Clancy used to say, when this craphead is thinking about that craphead, he's not thinking about this craphead, right? And it has some leverage into relieving me of the bondage of self. Now, I sponsor a lot of guys all the way up from to 50 years sober down. But I always need some new guys. I just need them. I need guys that are running around with their hair on fire like Chicken Little and the sky is falling, right? I always need one or two guys like that. Because the guys that are sober, like Kent, who calls me up, he's always doing pretty good. I mean, occasional problem, not too much. He has not much leverage on my bondage of self. The new guys, you spend an hour with some guy whose hair's on fire that's crazy. You'll come away, and if nothing else, you'll go, what? You might even say this to him. My sponsor would say this to me. You know, it could be worse. Yeah, how could it be worse? Well, it could be me. Clancy used to say that to people all the time. Oh. And I get relieved of the bondage of self through this. And, God's been very, very kind to me. You know, when I say in the 7-step prayer, I ask him to take away the things that stand in the way of my usefulness. It is the reclaiming of my real purpose in life. And it's not me. I mean, I got to Alcoholics Anonymous just like every other alcoholic I've ever met. I already had a primary purpose. It was me and my feelings and my comfort and my security and my money and me. And you're asking me to, as it says in the prayer of St. Francis, to forget it. Self-forgetting. Push all that aside. Push it all aside. And to serve. Alcoholics Anonymous is the only organization on the planet that I know of where you'll come in a big shot and work your way up to servant. Everywhere else, it's the other way around. You'll get a job, you'll sweep the floor and hope someday you're the manager, you know. Alcoholics Anonymous, you come in the big shot, and as high as you can get here is a servant that's working hard to try to live a life of other-centeredness, of God reliance, and failing continually. I never quite get there. But Bill Wilson had a great conversation. I first heard this from a guy named Paul, who was one of the way back archivists, and he ran Stepping Stones. Some of you probably been to Stepping Stones. And Paul told me the story that's actually, parts of it are reprinted in AA literature, about when Bill was sober a long time. They had the house, they were getting the house, they were about to get, and the book was out, and things were going very stable in Alcoholics Anonymous. They were stable in his life, he was doing very well. And he said to Ed Dowling, he said, you know, God's been really good to me. I got all this. And he said, but it's not enough. He said, I don't feel like I've grown enough. I don't feel like I have enough. I don't feel like I'm close enough to God. I don't feel like here's a man who's helped millions of people. He says, I don't feel like I've helped enough. And Father Ed said to him something that I've taken to heart. He said, oh, Bill, he said, you have what we in the clergy consider to be God's greatest blessing. It's called divine dissatisfaction. It's the itch that Carl Jung talks about. It's the thirst. It's the yearning for God. And it drives us. It drives us to be more than what we were. It drives us towards the light, or it can drive you to your death. And I think when it says in our book that we we had one choice, and Kent was talking about this. Either God's everything or he's nothing. I think guys like me, every day I'm conscious of it. I don't always understand it, but every day I stand at the turning point, and I can go into the light or I can go into Bob. Every day. And I'm telling you, there are days when I make the wrong choice, and often when I make the wrong choice, I don't even know I've made the wrong choice until I start to reap the consequences of the bad choice, right? Because I don't think anyone here can grow spiritually above your humanity. You can't. I've tried, and I wanted to badly. I wanted to be the guy that would come to meetings and people go, I touched the hem of his garment. Many, many decades ago, I realized there's no danger of that. No. But in our usefulness to others is often contained within our flaws, in our defects. That's why I think that God leaves some defects in place, because in some obscure way that I may never really understand, those defects make me useful. I get it from a distance, because there have been times in my sobriety where I've really screwed up. I mean, I feel ashamed of myself. I did something I swore I wasn't going to do, and I did it, and I feel bad, and I'm embarrassed. And in those moments, I'm not going to go and talk to a saint, because I got to go and find somebody who has struggled with a lot of the things I've struggled with. Because first and foremost, before I ever take it to God, before I ever take it through the steps, before I ever do any of that, I have to reduce the feelings of separation and uniqueness. Because if my ego can get me alone feeling like I'm the only one stained like this, it will have its way with me. And so I have a whole network of guys. Kent's one of them. I have a bunch of guys. Dawn, my sponsor sometimes she's like perfect. I mean, now Clancy, no, he wasn't perfect. Now, Clancy was very human. And I go to guys like that when I'm having a tough time, when I've missed the mark, when I'm not the guy I want to be, and I'm not the guy that God wants me to be, and I miss it. And I go to you because I know you're like me. And I need that. I really need to know I'm not alone. And then once some of that separation is reduced, now me and God can do some business. Now me and my sponsor can do some business. So maybe that's why God's kept certain defects of character in place in myself and a lot of us, is somehow it contributes to my usefulness. Who would have thought that? And so I keep this a piece of business. I'll tell you one quick little story. This is probably 25 to 30 years ago. I was sponsoring a guy from California who had about 10 years sober, and he's not doing well. And he says, I got to come up and see. I can't do this on the phone. I'm just a mess. I said, okay, come on up. And he drove up. He came to my house, knocked on the door, and came in. And he's a basket case. So he says, I think I need some work on step 11. Because he sponsored a lot of guys. And I said, well, let's start looking at this. And you know what we discovered? The deficiency was in step 6. Because step 6 is easy to imagine you've done it, but innermost self stuff, very difficult to do. And he used a term that I've used ever since then. He called step 6 the Judas step. And I said, Judas step? He said, yeah, if one of the 12 betrays you, it's probably step 6. And so step 6 is a big piece of business in my life because of the truth. And the truth is, God can, I can't. I gotta find a way to let him. Thanks for listening.